The string quartet was finishing the prelude when somebody in the crowd laughed, a polite, practiced laugh that sounded like fine crystal clinking against porcelain. The terrace looked like a dream, 300 faces under fairy lights, white linen that shimmered, towering bouquets spilling blush roses and white lilies, and the kind of floral arches that make you want to weep at how perfectly everything was arranged. Waiters drifted like ghosts between tables, champagne caught the light in slow motion, and a photographer hovered by the aisle, clicking like a metronome. I was in the front row, family section, as invisible as a shadow at noon. My dress was the kind of modest navy that says, "I tried, but not too hard." My grandmother's pearls lay steady at my throat. I kept my hands folded. I kept my smile measured. That was the plan. To be the steady, grateful mother of the groom, who didn't make a scene, who let the young people have their day. I had rehearsed the right expression for the right moments. I had laminated my composure like a talisman. Then she appeared. Jessica came down the staircase like a script written to impress. Her dress caught the sun and the eyes of half the room. The bridesmaids fanned behind her in gowns that cost more than my monthly grocery bill. Patricia, her mother, glided beside her like a proud statue that had somehow learned to breathe. Patricia's pearls were different from mine. They glowed and demanded attention. They stopped near the gift table. Patricia's smile was varnished with a kind of pity that thinks itself generosity. She glanced over at me the way you might glance at a charity exhibit. Interested, tolerant, slightly disgusted. She leaned toward her sister and, in a voice made for stage whispers and crystal chandeliers, said, loud enough that people at the next table could hear, "She shouldn't even be here. Look at her. She's embarrassing us." It wasn't quite a whisper. It was an arrogant, honeyed barb cast into the center of the room, and for a second every polite murmur seemed to bend toward it. You could have heard a page turn in the program. The bridesmaids smiled a little too wide, and that smile cut. Jessica didn't let the moment pass. She stamped it with cruelty of her own. She chirped forward, a perfect, rehearsed scoff. "Please, someone hide her. She looks like a charity case in that dress." Laughter broke, high, brittle, immediate. The kind of laugh that tastes like relief because you're on the inside of the joke. Heads turned. Conversations paused. Conversations that had been about chairs and caterers and whether Uncle Dave would get up to speak at all, pivoted toward me. Everything inside me shrank. There's a peculiar, sharp cold that sweeps through the chest when the world recalibrates and you find, mid-breath, that you are the object of spectacle. I felt every eye like a weight. My throat thickened. My hands wanted to grip the pearls until the string snapped. For a second I did nothing but remember. Summers of casseroles, mornings of doing the bills alone, the years when my son was small and my hands smelled of flour and soap. I felt the long, quiet accumulation of a life, the way a house collects dust and light, and then this single clean insult tried to sweep it all away. It's a strange thing, how small a person can feel when paper-thin judgments are made about them in a room full of people who will probably never know their name. Shame has a geometry. It makes you fold into the smallest shape possible. But shame can also be the match that lights a dry thing. That was the point my heart reached just before my son moved. Tyler heard it. He was near the altar, that nervous, handsome version of himself in his new tuxedo, the same boy who had once glued paper boats in the bathtub and asked about constellations. The look that crossed his face when those words hit him, the specific line about charity, shivered something open in him. Pride. Protection. Something fierce and sudden that belonged to the son I had raised. His jaw clenched. His hands, which had been smoothing something on his sleeve, went still. The string quartet faltered. You could feel the air tighten like a drawn drum skin. He didn't hesitate. He moved the way someone in a dream moves when they know exactly what must be done, with a speed and clarity that made the room feel like slow film footage. He stepped forward, straight to the microphone position for the minister. The chatter that had followed the laugh cut off on a single breath. 100 conversations died mid-sentence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, and his voice carried with that precise mix of calm and thunder that makes people stop breathing. I'm going to make an announcement. Jessica's face, which had been all practiced radiance, flickered. Patricia's smile thinned, as if someone had erased the gloss from it. The bridesmaids' laughter drowned into a soft, surprised silence. I watched him the way mothers watch their children at the edge of a pond, poised for something dangerous and brave and irrevocable. Everything in the space between his first breath on that microphone and the event that followed stretched tight enough to hear the world thinking. Guests leaned in. The photographer kept clicking, slower now, more urgent. Someone in the back swore softly. A child began to cry, the sound small and terrible in a room that had been set for celebration. Tyler looked at me then. Not with pity, not with embarrassment, but with the solemn, fulsome look of a son recognizing wrong and deciding to set it right. That look was an answer, a promise, a sentence. He reached up and removed his boutonniere with the precise, almost ceremonious care of someone taking something off to make a statement. He did not speak the words right away. The hush waited for the rest of him. He looked at the bride, and what he said next was a blade wrapped in velvet. 2 sentences can cut longer than any long speech. He stepped away from the altar. He stopped the music, and standing before every single person who'd come to witness their happiness, he did the thing you never expect in a room built for easy applause. He canceled the wedding. The sound of the gasp traveled like a small animal through the crowd, sharp, surprised, impossible to ignore. Bottles rocked. A napkin dropped. Someone's hand covered a mouth. Jessica's bouquet slipped from her fingers as if it burned. Her face drained. I sat very still, the pearls cool against my throat. The world in the room had realigned. It felt as if a scythe had cut across the rehearsed future they had all agreed upon. I don't remember all the words that came after, only the way the silence broke into chaos, and the way, in that broken space, I felt something else take root, a feeling that this was not the end they had meant for me. And what happened next destroyed everything they had built. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your city below and tap subscribe if you don't want to miss the rest, because what comes next started long before the flowers were arranged and the champagne uncorked. Take a breath with me. If you just walked in, rewind that image of 300 people clapping and then falling silent the moment Tyler stopped the music. Hold that silence. That pause is where everything pivoted. And the truth is, the insult at the wedding was the final thread of a rope that had been pulling tight for months. This is the part of the story where most people expect a sudden fight in the aisle or a melodramatic argument. That's not what happened. Instead, the moment became a doorway. A doorway that opened not onto revenge staged for spectacle, but onto a patient, precise plan that had been growing quietly beneath the surface. I'm going to walk you back now. To the quieter days, the small cuts, the polite humiliations, so you'll understand why one offhand line could ignite something so dramatic. But first, tell me, have you ever been underestimated? Type yes or no. And if you've ever been told to know your place, I want you to lean into this next section with me. Because I wasn't looking for a show of power that day. I'd already been building one in the dark. All right, let's go back to where it began. I learned to be quiet in the kind of way that people mistake for weakness. There's quiet that is empty and quiet that is deliberate. I lived in the second kind. My life before Tyler grew up was woven from ordinary things. A job that paid the bills, a kitchen that smelled like baking on Sunday afternoons, a small garden where I debated tulips versus daffodils come spring. I kept the house tidy not because anyone demanded it, but because order soothed me. I learned to measure my words the way you measure sugar for a recipe, with care and an eye for balance. People in Cedar Falls had neat categories for each other. I was the widow who brought casseroles to church potlucks. I was the one who drove a faithful Honda that had never seen a valet. I was the one people assumed had aged into a life of quiet frugality. It suited me. There is dignity in ordinary things. There is power in being underestimated. The trick, I discovered, was letting the world build a picture of you that served its own arrogance while you quietly did the work of building your future. Jessica stepped into our lives like someone sent from a magazine photo shoot with instructions. She had that deliberate sort of charm that's been practiced until it reads as instinct. The first time I met her was at my son's birthday dinner, an evening meant for laughter and cake. She spent most of it photographing her salad and asking me about my plans for later life, the kind of question that, when asked with the right look, implies fragility and dependence. Her voice had a sugar-coated edge that made the question feel like a verdict. The second time she visited, she brought her mother, Patricia. I remember Patricia's entrance the way you remember a stage entrance. Regulated, polished, full of the little signals wealthy people use to say, without ever saying, "We did well." Her pearls caught the dining room light like spotlights. She eyed our modest photos on the wall as if they were quaint artifacts in a museum. When she suggested, almost kindly, that I might consider downsizing, the word landed with the precision of a surgeon's knife. She didn't ask if I could afford it. She assumed I couldn't. That assumption is a form of violence because it erases a person's years of work and choices and reduces them to a tidy stereotype. Little things added up. At gatherings, Jessica took pictures for her social accounts while leaving everyone else to hold stilted conversations about weather and wedding plans. At one dinner, she complimented a neighbor's homemade pie, then asked me, sotto voce, if I ever considered buying pre-made desserts to save time. Once, during a polite tour of their estate, Patricia casually recommended assistance, options for the elderly, like 5-minute sales pitches disguised as concern. These were all small cuts. The smile that didn't reach the eyes, the dismissive that's sweet, that means not relevant. Each remark was a small stone laid on a path that led toward larger assumptions, that our family belonged in a certain place, that we were grateful for the scraps of their inclusion. Tyler watched with a kind of naive trust that was completely his. He loved them, and when someone you love is invited into a new world, you want to believe the world is kind. He'd grown up with me, with my kitchen lessons, my thrift store flair, with nights of helping him with homework and mornings spent driving him to school when his father was sick. He never saw the world as stacked against him the way I had learned to. So when Gordon, Jessica's father, offered him a managerial role at a dealership, Tyler lit up like someone given a map and a key. The offer sounded like a gift. Beneath the charm, it was a possibility to be tethered. What I knew from years of paying attention was practical. I understood how businesses can look impressive from the outside while creaking at the foundation. I watched stock movements with a kind of quiet delight. I read annual reports the way some people read novels. My late husband had been careful with modest things and insisted on discipline in savings. After he died, I kept to a habit of putting away more than we needed and learning from choices rather than impulsive wants. When you do that for long enough, you build a margin of safety that can become the seed of something larger. I never boasted about it. Why would I? What would boasting have bought me? In a room full of people willing to judge by outward signs, silence can be armor. The weeks leading up to the wedding became a rehearsal of small humiliations. Invitations were worded with the kind of welcome that feels generous until you realize it has razor edges. Seating charts included the notation, groom's family, modest presence. They sent favors without asking if they wanted to accommodate ours, planning vendors that spoke a language of price tags and exclusivity. When I offered help a rehearsal dinner idea, a local florist I loved, they smiled and deflected with practiced politeness. We have plans, Patricia would say, eyes a little too bright. We're keeping everything in-house. Keep the margins tidy, I thought. Keep the narrative controlled. I quietly filed each refusal like a note in a ledger. Sometimes the smallness is worse than the big insult. Big insults can be confronted, yelled back at, made into theater. Small, consistent exclusions suffocate because they're easy for others to deny and easy for you to internalize. It was during one of those rehearsals, a rehearsal at the country club where the chairs were polished enough to see your face, that I felt that accumulation like a rainstorm coming. People made jokes about fitting in. Someone suggested, gently, that I might want to consider looking at retirement communities for convenience. A toast was made to new families blending and to people being comfortable in their new roles. The words were laced with hospitality. The undertone was containment. A quiet consequence of living that way is you start to catalog people in ways that are less about malice and more about clarity. I began to notice patterns in their spending, in the ways they boasted. The dealerships, the land, the lavish events. They glimmered like a surface you might want to touch, but which, upon closer inspection, was lacquered over cracks. In late-night research sessions at the kitchen table between a crossword and an envelope of bills, I began to look up things other people assumed I didn't know how to read. I learned what collateral looked like on balance sheets. I learned to track mortgage liens. I learned to read the tone of a company's press release the way a chef reads a knife. It wasn't spite at that point. It was a quiet inventory of facts that didn't match the picture the Walshes painted. They presented themselves as secure and absolute. The records suggested other rhythms: leverage, reliance on easy credit, and habits that required continuous cash flow. That knowledge didn't change how I sat at the table or how I tied my garden gloves. It only changed the way I considered future moves. If you're going to defend something, your son's future, your dignity, you don't always confront with a raised voice. Sometimes you build options behind the scenes. All of these small days and small cuts led toward one unremarkable morning when I realized that the world the Walshes curated was not the immutable fortress they claimed. It was a stage. And the more I watched, the more I saw opportunities not for spectacle, but for structural correction. I was no longer merely a woman taking the sting of a cruel joke. I was someone who saw an opening and, quietly, began to prepare. There's a moment, usually around late evening, when the house is quiet and the walls hold your secrets, when you realize the difference between being overlooked and being underestimated. One is harmless. The other is fuel. Mine came on an ordinary Tuesday. The sun had set behind the rooftops, leaving the street lamps buzzing and the kitchen warm with that yellow kind of light that makes everything look smaller. I sat at the table with a cup of chamomile tea, the steam curling like a lazy thought. My laptop was open, not to social media or recipe blogs, but to numbers. Lots of numbers. Columns of them. Rows upon rows of decisions I'd made over 15 years. People think you need noise to do big things. You don't. You need quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't ask for applause. I clicked open the folder labeled JH Trust, initials belonging to my husband, James Henderson. He'd passed when Tyler was 12, leaving behind a modest insurance payout, a final love letter disguised as practicality. I invested it because grief needed something to do with its hands. I learned because learning gave me a sense of control in a world that had suddenly taken it away. Little by little, year by year, I accumulated more knowledge, more strategy, more assets. When the document loaded that night, and the total balance blinked back at me, $3.4 million, I didn't gasp. I didn't cry. I didn't even smile. I just nodded. Confirmed what I'd always known. I had built something real while the world thought I was folding laundry. That was the first reveal. The second came when I decided to pull up the Walsh family's publicly available financial records. A curiosity at first, then a rabbit hole. Wealthy people forget that public and private rarely mean what they think. Records speak. They whisper if you know how to listen. And I listened very carefully. The estate that dazzled everyone? Mortgaged deeply. The trio of car dealerships? Profitable on paper, but heavily leveraged, riding loans like surfboards. The mother's old money? Old, yes. Money, not so much. Properties shuffled between accounts. Loans renewed rather than paid. Partnerships that looked pretty, but limped underneath. Their wealth was a stage costume. Elaborate, glittering, falling apart at the seams if you tugged too hard. I sat back in my chair, fingers steepled. It wasn't joy I felt. It was clarity. They had treated me like a liability, like a burden, like a woman they'd eventually have to take care of. They had spoken to me as if I would one day need their charity, while their entire empire was a house made of glass. Oh, I whispered into the empty kitchen, you made a mistake. A bad one. And that's when the plan began to take shape. Project Restoration. That's what I called it. Not revenge, restoration. Restoration of dignity. Restoration of balance. Restoration of my son's future from hands that intended to hold it like a leash. I made a list, not of people but of vulnerabilities. The dealership with the weakest cash flow. The property tied to 2 separate loans. The land parcel they assumed no one knew about. The business partnership with pending renewal. The shopping center stake likely to be sold soon at a premium. Each was a thread, and a gentle tug could unravel everything. Before bed, I opened an email draft to my financial advisor, Robert. I'd like to make some changes to the portfolio. Please prepare a liquidity pathway for $600,000, discreetly. I'll explain when we meet. Discreetly was important. Wealth whispers, remember. It rarely shouts unless it's desperate. The next morning, I met with Robert in his walnut-paneled office. He greeted me with that professional warmth reserved for steady, predictable clients, the kind like me. The kind who rarely ask for anything unusual. Margaret, he said, adjusting his glasses. This is a significant change. Are you sure? I took a breath, steady and deliberate. I'm very sure. May I ask what this is for? A family investment. I replied calmly. Long-term security. He nodded, impressed in that subtle way advisors are when a quiet client suddenly reveals she knew exactly what she was doing all along. Next was my attorney, a sharp-minded woman named Claire, who had the patience of a saint and the instincts of a hawk. I need to form a new company, I said. A holding entity. For real estate? Among other things. She clasped her hands. Who will be listed as the primary owner? I didn't hesitate. My son, Tyler. Her eyebrows rose slightly. The good kind of surprise. All right. We can structure it so he holds controlling interest, but you maintain oversight until he's ready. Perfect, I said. As we drafted the paperwork, something odd happened. I felt taller. Not physically, but in the spine. In the way my shoulders shifted back. In the way my breath expanded. Years of polite shrinking had formed a habit, but that habit cracked that morning. It cracked because now I wasn't merely responding to cruelty. I was working with purpose. By lunchtime, the new company existed. Henderson Assets LLC. Clean. Quiet. Invisible to the Walsh family. A container ready to be filled with opportunities. By evening, I had pulled every document into a binder. Contracts, term sheets, valuations, preliminary offers. A quiet empire in the making. And not a single soul, not Tyler, not Jessica, not the Walshes, had any idea. That night, I walked into my garden. The moon laid pale light over the soil where tulips had once bloomed. I stood there, inhaling the cool night air, listening to the crickets, feeling the ground that had carried me through so many seasons. They made a mistake underestimating me, I murmured. Not in anger, not even in bitterness, but in truth. People assume that a quiet woman is a fragile one. A simple woman is a naive one. A humble woman is a powerless one. But quiet is strategic. Simple is disciplined. Humble is focused. And a focused woman can build an avalanche. Project Restoration had begun. I didn't need applause. I didn't need recognition. I needed only one thing. Timing. The wedding would give me that. And when the moment came, when the right insult landed in the right silence, everything they thought they built would tremble, then break. And I would be ready. The weeks leading up to the wedding unfolded like a series of perfectly arranged social traps, decorated with lace, scented with expensive candles, and designed to look harmless until you stepped inside them. Then you'd realize the lace was a net, the candles were cover, and the smiles hiding the traps were polished like silver. It began with something small. It always begins small, the kind of moment most people shrug past because it doesn't draw blood, only bruises. One windy Wednesday afternoon, Jessica invited me over to her parents' estate to finalize wedding arrangements. I arrived early, as I always did. Punctuality was one of the few personal disciplines I wore like armor. Patricia opened the door with a smile engineered in the same place her plastic surgeries had been. Tight, stretched, practiced. "Oh, Margaret," she said, kissing both sides of my cheeks but touching nothing. "How lovely that you came early. We've already started without you." I stepped inside. Jessica was seated at the marble island, surrounded by 3 wedding planners, each holding tablets. Brochures littered the surface like confetti charts. She didn't greet me. She simply announced, "Mother and I were thinking it's best if we handle the significant parts of the wedding ourselves. Things like the venue, guest list, photography, menu, the big decisions." One of the planners, a slim woman with a severe bun, nodded sympathetically toward me, the kind of sympathy reserved for small wounded animals. Patricia stepped beside her daughter. "Of course, you can help with the smaller things." She tapped her chin. "Perhaps the napkins." The napkins. For decades of building a life. Years of raising a boy alone. Bills paid, crises managed, funerals attended, birthdays planned, heartbreak soothed, and that was what I was reduced to. A napkin consultant. I smiled politely. "I'll give it my best thought." "Oh, don't trouble yourself," Patricia said, voice dripping with gentle cruelty. "We'll pick something elegant. No need to strain your budget." There it was, the assumption. The insult made sugar sweet. They didn't know that the napkins in this house cost less than 1 hour of interest on my portfolio. But they didn't need to know. Not yet. Jessica's bridesmaids invited me, or rather, instructed me, to join them for a wedding dress fitting. "We want you to feel included," one of them giggled. "Included?" "Right." When I arrived, the boutique looked like a palace of white tulle and polished gold. Dresses hung like angels waiting to audition. Models floated. Assistants ran around balancing trays of champagne and cookies shaped like engagement rings. I sat quietly on a velvet bench, hands folded, pearls warm against my neck. Jessica emerged from the dressing room in the gown she'd chosen, a shimmering piece imported from Milan. The bridesmaids squealed. Patricia dabbed her eyes. The saleswoman clasped her hands in delight. Then Jessica turned to me. "So?" she asked. I smiled softly. "You look beautiful." She paused, blinked, tilted her head in mock confusion. "But you have such simple taste. I'm not sure you'd understand the style." The bridesmaids snickered. Patricia pretended not to hear. My stomach tightened, not with shame, but with the memory of all the nights I'd sat alone budgeting to keep my son's world stable, while she criticized me with a designer dress draped over her body. The saleswoman said to Patricia, loud enough for the entire boutique, "We should consider a gown for her, too. Something modest. Simple, affordable." Jessica answered for her. "Oh no, she has her own dress. It's very her." Patricia added, "We'll make sure she sits somewhere the photographers won't be distracted." Everyone laughed. Everyone except me. I simply held my purse a little closer and noted how each insult sharpened the future edges of project restoration. By the time the rehearsal dinner arrived, the humiliations had become routine, like tiny jabs meant to condition me into silence. The country club was a fortress of velvet upholstery, chandeliers, mahogany railings polished with enough care to blind someone who looked at them too long. I arrived in my navy dress, the same one I'd ironed carefully the night before. Patricia's expression flickered when she saw me, surprise mixed with disappointment. "You didn't bring anything else?" she asked, eyes scanning me as though expecting to find a stain. "This is fine," I answered. Jessica approached, laughing with her cousins. "We were just talking about matching family aesthetics, Mother. Did you tell her?" Patricia placed a manicured hand on Jessica's shoulder. "We discussed that the wedding photographs should reflect cohesion." Jessica smirked. "She means maybe you can sit behind some of the taller guests." Her cousins burst into laughter. A tall waiter passed by and actually slowed, sensing the static in the air. I breathed in slowly and sat. The dinner dragged on with more social acrobatics from the Walshes. They spoke of preserving class. They hinted that Tyler would rise socially after marrying up. They mentioned that my old-fashioned habits would be endearing for the grandchildren. Gordon toasted the union, saying, "When families blend, one side always learns how to improve." He raised his glass toward his wife's family.
Not toward me.
Tyler shifted uncomfortably, glancing at me often, sensing undercurrents he couldn't yet name.
And I
smiled the way a mountain does, unmoved by the wind. 3 days before the wedding, the Walshes invited me, intentionally late, to a planning committee meeting. When I arrived, seating assignments were already printed. Jessica tapped the chart. "I placed you next to the caterer's assistant and the piano tuner," she said with a sugary grin. "That way you won't feel overwhelmed." Overwhelmed? By who? People with multi-million-dollar illusions held together by bank loans? She continued, flipping her hair. "And no offense, but your dress isn't camera-friendly. So, we're trying to keep the angles flattering for everyone." The planners nodded sympathetically. Patricia leaned in. "We can arrange for you to use the side entrance on the wedding day. There will be fewer photographers there." My heart thudded, not in shame, but in understanding. They weren't just trying to hide me. They wanted me erased. Something inside me, something made of quiet steel and years of being everything except visible, clicked into place. I thought of Tyler's future, the one they wanted to mold like clay. I thought of their plans to guide him, to shape him, to position him under their umbrella of conditional acceptance.
They didn't want him as family. They wanted him as property.
"Oh," I said softly, "thank you for thinking of me." They mistook my calm for surrender. They mistook my politeness for weakness. They mistook my silence for permission. People always do, right before they learn. The day before the wedding looked like a scene from a lifestyle magazine. Trucks unloading orchids, chefs overseeing stations, decorators buzzing around like bees in a hive fueled by money and caffeine. Jessica approached, irritation on her face. "We need to talk about your makeup," she said. "My makeup?"
"Yes.
"The stylist says they're fully booked, so you'll need to either do yours at home or," she smiled thinly, "skip it." "Skip it," I echoed. Patricia joined her. "It's fine, dear. You have the natural look." Natural. As in plain. As in unimportant. Jessica added, "Maybe just avoid bright colors. You don't want to clash with the palette." Then came the final cut, the one that sealed their place in the story's crosshairs. Patricia whispered, loudly enough for the decorators nearby to hear. "It's almost sad. She's trying, but she'll always look like she wandered in from a church potluck." Jessica giggled. My fingers tightened around the folder in my hand, a folder containing legal documents, quiet acquisitions, purchase orders, and the outline of a plan that was almost complete. They didn't know that every insult was a countdown. Every humiliation was a brick. Every moment they tried to push me down was a step I used to climb. They were building the stage. They just didn't know the script wasn't theirs. And the humiliations climaxed. But the sting was gone. Because I knew something they didn't. Everything they built was already trembling. And soon, very soon, it would fall. The night after the rehearsal dinner, when the Walsh family toasted to improvement and made seating charts that treated me like a footnote, I sat at my kitchen table long after the lights in their mansion had gone out. The hum of my refrigerator was the only sound in the house. I pulled the thick binder toward me, the one labeled Project Restoration, and opened it flat. Pages of research, printed records, financial snapshots, maps of properties, potential acquisition routes. Gordon Walsh's empire was a facade coated in confidence. But underneath? It was a wobbly house of cards held together by short-term loans, vanity spending, and a level of financial carelessness only wealthy men with too much pride can afford. Every loan, every property, every asset had a story. And stories can be rewritten. Early the next morning, I walked into Robert's office. He looked surprised to see me, pleasantly, not alarmed. He respected me. That was one thing I'd always appreciated about him. "Margaret," he said, motioning for me to sit. "How can I help today?" "I need the liquidity pathway completed," I said, quietly. "No notices. No alerts." He nodded thoughtfully. We can liquidate some ETFs, rotate bonds. That'll give you immediate access without triggering large tax flags. And the trust. You want to dip into the Henderson Fund?
Yes.
Fully within our rights. I want everything arranged before Monday.
He paused.
Something in my tone told him not to ask why. Of course, he said. You'll have access to the full amount, just under $600,000 by Friday. I nodded. And Robert, I added, gathering my bag. Not a word to anyone. He straightened. We value privacy here. You have my word. Liquidity secured. My next stop was Claire, the attorney who had handled James' estate. Her office smelled of leather and lavender. Books lined the shelves like silent jurors. I need help setting up a structure, I said, placing my binder on her desk. She opened the cover and froze. Though she hid the surprise well. This is extensive. It's necessary. What sort of structure are you thinking? A holding company, I said plainly. A clean, simple entity that can absorb certain assets. And the owner? My son, I answered. But I control everything until he understands how to manage it. Smart, she murmured, already taking notes. Very smart. We drafted the papers for a company named Henderson Restoration Group. Claire glanced up. Restoration. Yes, I said. This isn't an attack. It's a correction. She nodded slowly, as if understanding something deeper than the words. 2 hours later, the company existed, filed, legitimate, discreet, invisible, and within it lay space for something far larger. I never meant to pry. Not at first. But when people build their lives on illusions, the truth hides in the corners. I hired a private investigator, a quiet man named Lewis with a reputation for near-surgical accuracy. He didn't pry into gossip. He pried into documents. He arrived at my house late in the afternoon, wearing a press shirt and carrying a laptop. Tell me what you need, he said. Everything on the Walsh family business, I replied. Contracts, debts, liens, property positions. And I want the truth, not the version they show the world. He nodded once. Confidential? Absolutely. Over the next 3 days, Lewis gathered more than I expected. The dealerships were struggling. The luxury home had 2 active mortgages. A commercial property was weeks away from foreclosure. An entire block of land they boasted about had a high-risk loan attached. A partnership with a supplier was collapsing. Multiple unpaid invoices were creeping toward litigation. And most importantly, 2 of their assets were quietly listed for sale, the kind of desperation rich families hide at all costs. I spent hours reviewing every detail until I found the weak point. Their commercial property. If someone bought the debt attached to it, the Walsh family would fold. I closed the file slowly. That someone would be me. By Thursday morning, the liquidity had cleared. By Thursday afternoon, Henderson Restoration Group pulled the trigger. Claire prepared the papers. Lewis procured the seller. Robert ensured the money moved quietly. A chain reaction began. First, we purchased the debt on the commercial property. Then, we acquired the land parcel the Walshes were secretly trying to offload. Then, we negotiated a silent buy-in to a third asset they used as collateral. All through shell pathways, so clean no one could trace anything back to me in seconds, or even minutes. The Walsh family still believed they were the wealthiest people in the room. But behind the scenes?
Piece by piece.
I own them. Friday evening, the night before the wedding, I sat alone under the warm kitchen lamp, reviewing documents one last time. Property titles, debt transfer receipts, ownership agreements, company filings, letters ready to be delivered Monday morning, notices of asset seizure scheduled to go out, the finalized binder, Walsh Holdings structural collapse analysis. Every humiliation they'd served me. Every time they laughed at my dress. Every time they whispered charity case. Every time they pushed me aside, had become another page in the binder. Not out of spite, not for vengeance, but because of something simple. My son deserved better than this family, and they would never, ever control him again. I placed the binder in my bag. Then I placed a second copy in a sealed envelope addressed to Tyler. I didn't know how the wedding would end, but I knew how the Walsh's empire would. And the best part? They still had no idea. Before bed, I stepped into my garden, the one place where life never pretended to be more than it was. The soil smelled rich. The air was still. The moon hung low, white and indifferent. I whispered into the night. They think I'm walking into tomorrow powerless. A soft breeze stirred my hair. But tomorrow I will walk in with their entire foundation in my hands. I closed my eyes. I thought of Tyler, of the boy I had raised with hands that shook sometimes and hands that held firm other times. I thought of how he smiled when life was simple. I thought of the future he deserved, not one built on manipulation and arrogance, but one built on worthiness and truth. Tomorrow, I whispered again, everything changes. Because the most powerful part of any plan is timing. The humiliation they delivered at the wedding? That would be the match. My plan? The explosion. Not dramatic. Not loud. Not destructive for destruction's sake. But strategic. Legal. Inevitable. By the time the sun rose on the wedding day, the Walsh Empire was already collapsing. They just hadn't been informed. Yet. The morning of the wedding smelled like luxury and arrogance. The Walsh estate, transformed into what guests kept calling a storybook venue, glittered under expensive chandeliers hung from white tent arches tall enough to house an orchestra. A floral pathway stretched like a river of petals. Staff dressed in crisp white moved in synchronization, trays held like offerings. Guests arrived in sleek cars, stepping out with sunglasses, diamonds, perfume that belonged in art galleries. There were 300 of them. Wealth, status, connections, every face chosen carefully by Patricia. If elegance could mock someone, it mocked me. I stepped out of my modest sedan, wearing the same navy dress I'd chosen days ago. I'd pressed it quietly that morning, steaming every wrinkle as if armoring myself. It wasn't couture. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply mine. Patricia spotted me before I'd even closed the car door. Her smile froze mid-expression. "Oh, Margaret," she said, her eyes sweeping over me like a scanner searching for flaws. "You wore that." I nodded gently. "Yes." Jessica joined her, her gown sparkling, her posture drenched in pride. She looked like a queen ready to inherit her kingdom. "Wow," Jessica breathed, turning to her bridesmaids. I mean, she really committed to that look. The bridesmaids laughed, soft and cruel. I smiled politely. "I'm comfortable." "That makes one of us," Patricia muttered. They walked away, whispering, giggling, floating in their imagined superiority. I stood there for a moment, watching them glide toward the entrance like nothing in the world could touch them. If only they knew. Inside the tent, the decor was breathtaking. Towering roses, glass centerpieces, strings of pearls, and lights that made everything glow like a dream. I approached the seating chart. My name sat at Table 29, behind a pillar, next to no one I recognized. Far from the stage. Far from the family section. Far from everything that mattered. A place meant to hide me. A place meant to minimize me. A place meant to tell the world. She is not one of us. One of the planners approached, clipboard in hand. "Oh, you're the groom's mother, right?" I nodded. "Great," she chirped. "We put you somewhere quiet, so you won't feel overwhelmed." Somewhere quiet. Overwhelmed. Words chosen with precision. Words meant to insult without appearing to insult. "Thank you," I whispered, even though the words tasted like dust on my tongue. As I moved through the crowd, snippets of conversation floated like daggers. "Is that her? The mother? I heard she lives simply. They said she doesn't have much. Poor thing. Jessica is rescuing that boy." Well, every fairy tale needs a charity subplot. Laughter. Eyes sliding past me. Faces politely pretending I wasn't there. Every insult buzzed like a wasp near my ear. They had no idea that their empire, this empire, was already owned by the woman they were gossiping about. But plans like mine don't shout early. They wait. They strike when silence breaks. I found Tyler near the dressing area. He looked nervous, excited, not aware of the shadow behind Jessica's family. He straightened his tie when he saw me. "Mom," he said softly, "you look nice." He meant it. That was enough. "You okay?" I asked. He nodded. "Just wedding jitters." I touched his arm. "I'm proud of you." His eyes softened. "Thank you." Then the coordinator rushed him away for photos. I watched him go. My boy, my life's work, walking straight into a storm. I wished for a moment that I could shield him from what was coming. But shielding him meant letting the Walshes control him. No. He deserved truth. He deserved freedom. He deserved a family who didn't measure people by dollar signs. The ceremony was minutes away when it happened, the moment that turned the air sharp, the moment that set the stage trembling. I was adjusting the small corsage pin to my dress when Patricia approached me again. She was alone this time, which meant she planned to say something she didn't want witnesses for, but said loudly enough to create witnesses. She leaned in, her perfume sharp enough to sting. "You know," she said, voice dripping with false concern, "you've done your best to blend in." "Really? You have?" I remained still. "But there's only so much we can do," she continued, her lips curving. "This wedding is elegant. And you, well..." She paused deliberately. "You're simple." I inhaled sharply. But she wasn't done. "And after today," she added, "your role in the family will be limited. We need stability for the children. Proper guidance. We'll take care of Tyler. He needs direction. He needs us." Her eyes gleamed with victory. She believed she had already won. She stepped back, letting her voice rise enough for guests to hear. "Please, someone keep her toward the back. She's distracting." Laughter. Heads turning. The familiar burn of humiliation crawling up my chest. Then Jessica arrived, stunning in her gown, basking in the admiration. She looked at me, glanced at my dress, and snorted. "Honestly, Mom, she looks like she wandered in from a budget banquet." The bridesmaids burst into laughter. Guests looked. Some smiled awkwardly. Others whispered. And in the middle of it all, I froze. Not from weakness. Not from shame. But because something inside me finally clicked into perfect alignment. This was the last cut. The final insult. The humiliation that confirmed everything. They didn't just disrespect me. They didn't just underestimate me. They believed they owned my son. They believed they owned the future. They believed their world was untouchable. And that belief was their mistake. I exhaled slowly. A calm, steady breath. The kind a person takes before stepping into destiny. Tyler wasn't nearby. Not yet. But someone had heard everything. Someone who mattered. Someone whose reaction would soon ignite the moment that stopped the entire wedding. The aisle music began. Guests hurried to their seats. Lights dimmed. Everything became glowing anticipation. Jessica took her place. Patricia straightened her dress. The bridesmaids lined up. The photographer raised his camera. The minister lifted his book. The room grew still. So still you could hear silk move. I took my seat in the shadows behind the pillar. My heart was steady. My face was calm. My bag held documents. My son held the truth. He just didn't know it yet. But he'd learn. Because the next 5 minutes would shatter the air. And what followed would bring down everything the Walsh family had built. Piece by piece. Brick by brick. Facade by facade. Until nothing remained. The world was seconds away from cracking. And I was ready. The music shifted to the soft, floating notes that signaled the beginning of the procession. Guests turned in perfect unison, rising to their feet like a sea of polished statues. The aisle glowed beneath white petals and overhead lanterns. The air felt too still, too anticipatory, like nature itself was holding its breath. Jessica stood poised at the entrance, framed beautifully by the floral arches. Her gown sparkled, as if the crystals were whispering her name. Cameras lifted. Guests sighed. Patricia dabbed the corner of her eyes with a silk handkerchief, already imagining the whispers. She raised her daughter so well. What a glorious wedding. What a powerful family. Arrogance soaked the air like perfume. I sat at the back, my chair angled just slightly behind the pillar. I could see everything, and yet I was meant to be invisible. A shadow. I folded my hands in my lap and waited. Because silence before a storm is not peace. It's warning. Patricia leaned toward Jessica one last time before the walk began. Her voice floated, just loud enough for those nearest to hear. Remember, darling. After tonight, she won't influence anything. We will guide Tyler. He's too naive to build a proper life without us. Jessica laughed, full and careless. Mom, please. Tyler will do whatever I say. He needs structure. Then, the sentence that would shatter the day. Honestly, marrying him is charity work for me. Look at his mother. She's proof he doesn't come from much. Her bridesmaids snorted. A few guests blinked. Patricia didn't flinch. Jessica smirked, adjusting her veil. She's pathetic. After tonight, she'll be background noise. The words dripped like acid onto marble. And someone heard them. Not me. Not a guest. Tyler. He had been standing on the other side of the archway, waiting for the music cue to step into place. Out of sight, but close enough to hear every syllable. His posture stiffened. His breath stopped. His hand tightened around the boutonniere pinned to his suit. For a moment, he didn't move. He turned slowly, and the expression on his face changed, erasing every illusion he'd held about the woman he was about to marry. Shock, hurt, disgust, and something else. Something like awakening. He looked over at me. I hadn't seen him arrive, but suddenly he was staring across the room, past the pillar, straight into my eyes. I had no idea what he'd heard, but I saw the decision form in his soul. He walked away from the ceremony entrance. And the moment he changed direction, the day changed with him. Jessica began her slow walk down the aisle, smiling, waving, soaking in the adoration like a queen descending from her throne. Guests lifted their phones. Children pointed. Patricia beamed. The music swelled, then stopped. Not faded. Stopped. Sharp. Abrupt. Jarring. A violin squealed. People gasped. A waiter dropped a tray in surprise. Jessica froze mid-step, confusion twisting her perfect features. Then, microphone feedback screeched across the speakers. Tyler stepped into the center of the stage, standing beside the minister. Eyes steady, shoulders raised. The guests murmured. The minister blinked. Son? Are you all right? But Tyler didn't answer him. He lifted the microphone. Silence fell like a curtain. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, voice calm, but trembling beneath the surface. Before we continue, I need to say something. Patricia stiffened. Jessica's smile snapped off her face. The bridesmaids exchanged nervous glances. I felt my pulse in my throat. Tyler looked out over the crowd, 300 faces staring back at him. I need to apologize, he began, to everyone who traveled here, everyone who thought today was going to be a celebration. A ripple moved across the room. Jessica blinked rapidly. Tyler? Sweetheart? What are you doing? He ignored her. He held the microphone with both hands now, steady as stone. I overheard something, he continued. Something that I cannot and will not ignore. The crowd leaned in. Jessica's smile sharpened into a silent warning. Tyler, Patricia hissed. Later. Not now. He looked at her, a look so cold it emptied the air around her. No, Patricia. Now. Gasps. Patricia's face drained. Jessica took a small step forward. Baby, breathe. You're just overwhelmed. Let's talk in the back. Tyler shook his head. Not overwhelmed, he said clearly. Enlightened. He turned to the audience. I heard Jessica say marrying me is charity work. that my mother is pathetic, that I will do whatever she says, that I come from nothing, that I need her family to guide me. A collective gasp swept across the venue. Jessica's face flushed crimson. Tyler, that is not what I... He held up a hand. Stop. The word echoed. Jessica froze. Patricia paled. I have ignored a lot of red flags, he said, voice rising. I told myself people change. That maybe the judgment, the arrogance, the insults were just stress. He swallowed hard. But when you insult the woman who raised me, the woman who sacrificed everything for me, the woman who built me from scratch. He shook his head slowly. I draw the line. Jessica took another shaky step forward. Tyler, please. He cut her off again. I am not marrying you. The room exploded. Shouts. Screams. Gasps. Phones whipped into the air. Someone stumbled into a chair. A child began to cry. Jessica collapsed to her knees, veil trembling. Her bridesmaids froze like dolls in a shop window. Patricia erupted. Tyler, you don't understand. She didn't mean it. He glared at her. I understand perfectly. And I will not let you, any of you, disrespect my mother. Then he turned, slowly, deliberately, toward me. He raised the microphone again. Mom, he said, voice cracking, I'm so sorry you were treated like this. You deserved better from all of us. My breath left me. I didn't move, didn't blink. He took a step toward me, then another, until the attention of the entire wedding shifted from the glittering aisle to the forgotten corner behind the pillar. A forgotten corner that now held the center of the universe. He reached me, placed his hand on my shoulder, and faced the crowd. This, he said, voice fierce, is the only woman here worthy of respect. You could hear a pin drop. Jessica sobbed. Patricia trembled. The guests stared, stunned. Tyler breathed deeply, then delivered the line that scorched the earth beneath their feet. And if you insult my mother, you insult me. This wedding is over. Dead silence. Then, complete, unrecoverable chaos. Patricia screamed. Jessica begged. Gordon cursed, storming toward the stage. You ungrateful boy. You want to throw away a future we built for you? Tyler didn't flinch. You didn't build my future, he said. She did. He pointed to me. And everything you built. His voice sharpened with truth. It's already falling apart. The room gasped. Jessica stumbled to her feet. What is that supposed to mean? Tyler looked at her with heartbreaking calm. You'll find out tomorrow. The minister closed his book. The band stopped pretending to play. Guests swarmed the exits. Reporters whispered. Cameras flashed. The Walshes stood frozen, defeated, humiliated, while Tyler took my hand gently and whispered, Let's go home, Mom. And as we walked out of the ruined wedding, leaving behind silk and roses and a collapsing kingdom, I whispered back, this was only the beginning. Because the next morning, everything they built finally fell apart. Morning arrived like a press release. I woke to the phone buzzing with a kind of polite urgency that meant the world had noticed. It was 7:43. By 8:15, Robert's name had rung 3 times. My attorney Claire had left 2 voicemails. The private investigator Lewis texted a single line. They're reading the filings. Good timing. Outside, the sunlight cheered the garden into motion. Tulip leaves unfurling, birds unconcerned. But inside the kitchen the air felt like the moment after a stage collapse when dust still hung and people moved in slow disbelief. Morning, Mrs. Henderson, Robert said on the second ring, voice clipped but steady. You have 3 requests for interviews. A local reporter, a financial magazine, and someone from the State Business Journal. Not today, I said. My voice didn't sound like mine. It sounded like someone who had been waiting for years to be heard. Of course, he replied. But there are more urgent matters. The debt transfers, they're being flagged on the Walsh accounts. We are receiving callbacks from lenders. I set the kettle down, and the kettle sang. I let it cool into steam rather than panic. By 9 o'clock the first reporter had arrived. Polite, with that half-apologetic tone journalists use when they know they're digging into somebody's ruin. By 10, the Cedar Falls Gazette, the paper that had printed wedding announcements for decades, had a reporter on the lawn. By 11, my phone looked like it had been riddled with bee stings. What happened? Tyler asked when he slid into the kitchen, still in his tuxedo from the day before, hair ruffled but eyes clearer than they'd ever been. He looked like a man who'd had a storm blow through his life and found the air freshly clean. "They've started calling about the Riverside property," I said. "And the dealership liens. It looks worse than we modeled." "It's okay. It's expected." He sank into a chair, fingers steepled. "Do you want me there for interviews?" "No," I said. "Today we do the business. We let the lawyers do the talking." I handed him the sealed folder I'd prepared the night before. "Open this when you can breathe." He took it like a relic and tucked it under his arm. Within hours, Gordon Walsh's phone became a battleground. Lenders he'd assumed friendly began asking for payments. Suppliers emailed reminder, notices flagged as urgent. Tenants in one of the shopping parcels sent formal notices about overdue invoices. At noon, I received a call from the property management firm that handled the Riverside Shopping Center. Their voice was polite, then frank. "Mrs. Henderson, we've had an inquiry from a major investor expressing interest in consolidating ownership. There are offers on the table." That was Robert's doing. He had engineered a silent approach to the market, the thing many investors do when they want speed and leverage. It was surgical. We made sure motivated sellers would meet our terms rather than the Walsh's inflated expectations. The offer we arranged reported as fair market value, but to a family desperate to stabilize cash flows, it might as well have been the final bell. Gordon, who had once puffed and preened over his empire, now ran to boardrooms with his hands empty and his voice small. He called me twice, once to demand explanation, once to threaten. I let Claire manage his threats while Robert handled the money. "Margaret," he said in a strained call, "you don't understand the legal implications. You can't just—" "We did it legally," Claire replied when she took the line. "All transfers are valid. If you want to contest them, you'll have to go through the courts. And you should speak with your counsel." There was a silence that sounded like the rustling of paper folding. By afternoon, the social fallout began on two fronts, gossip and ledger. Neighbors came by with awkward sympathy, the type you give someone who's lost a small thing, not someone who'd just unmasked a lie. My neighbors clasped my hands and said, "We're sorry you had to go through that," but their eyes were kinder than before, no condescension left. At the same time, the Gazette's headline was a slow, methodical unravel. "Wedding cancelled, local dealerships, estates under scrutiny." Inside, the reporter, who'd known the Walsh family for years, wrote carefully, an even keel that hinted at scandal, without sensationalism. The story lined up the public facts with our filings, and the truth landed like cool rain. People began to call. There were sobbing calls from suppliers who'd been stiffed, quiet inquiries from business partners who realized the cash flow was irregular, and a voicemail from the country club, their annual gala now in doubt without Walsh sponsorship. By dusk, property signs began to change. The Walsh estate, with its sweeping lawn and marble columns, was listed for sale by a new broker. Not a rumor. A professionally printed board planted in the front lawn. Patricia's voice on the TV the next morning, an interview in which she tried to sound composed, sounded less like conviction and more like a person clutching at words that would not hold. "We are assessing circumstances," she said, lips barely moving when she tried to smile. Her pearl necklace seemed heavy on live television. People who'd once tasted her buttered compliments now looked at her differently. Her social invitations thinned. Her charity lunches were canceled with calls that explained budgetary concerns. Social media did the rest. Clips of the wedding, Tyler's microphone pause, Jessica's collapse, Patricia's whispers, spread like a flaring signal. The phrase charity case trended in local hashtags, but what captured the internet's attention was the follow-up, documents. Screenshots of contracts, scanned receipts, and public notices began circulating, not sensationalized, but presented like evidence. Friends of the Walsh children called from out of town, hesitant, pleading. Local business leaders cleared their calendars. Sponsors withdrew. The country club issued a formal statement that because of pending financial uncertainty, their sponsorship agreements might need to be renegotiated. The world the Walshes had used to buoy their social capital. Dinners, parades, introductions folded inward as contacts made cautious, protective choices. The dealerships, the most visible symbol of Gordon's pride, were hit first in practical ways. One of their credit lines was frozen pending review. Suppliers demanded assurances. The regional lender hinted it could call certain notes due. It's one thing to appear wealthy in photos, it's another to produce the cash flow needed to keep a lavish lifestyle. When the flow halts, things damage quickly. Gordon's calls to his partners became frantic. I watched one of them on my TV from the garden window, pacing, face red, shoulders hunched. He tried to rally allies, but allies do not always make good on friendship when equity is at stake. He called Claire. He threatened legal action. Claire smiled tightly and read the filings back at him. Dates, signatures, legitimate transfers. You made choices that were leverage dependent, she said slowly. We simply exercised the contractual remedies available. Gordon's posture crumpled with the knowledge that a posture cannot stand without foundation. By the end of the week, there were quiet auctions, bank-assisted sale notices taped to store windows, service vehicles sold to cover arrears. One of the Walsh's rental properties transferred into Henderson Restoration's control after an unpaid lien matured. Not a spectacle, legal, procedural, clinical. But the procedural nature made it worse. It was proof that the facade had been removed. Months passed in the public eye like edited film. Patricia attempted several conciliatory calls. The first was clumsy, full of apology couched in a way that still implied superiority. We never meant to be unkind. It all got carried away. Perhaps we misjudged. Tyler refused the first 2 hurried apologies and fielded them for my sake before deciding they were insincere. Jessica attempted to call. Her voice was a tremor. Tyler, please, she began. He listened, painful and patient. We'll do whatever it takes to make this right, she pleaded. He put his finger to his lips and said, No, Jessica. We will not perform for you. Gordon, broken, showed up once at my door, unannounced, sleeves rolled up. Not the polished man the town knew, but someone frayed at the edges. For a long time, he simply stood on the porch, the way people stand when they bring bad news to someone they once thought small. Margaret, he said, voice raw, we can make this right. Let us pay you back. We will call the lenders. We will. He trailed off. I looked at him the way one looks at a man who has been allowed to forget that actions have consequences. You can try, I said. But the truth is this. You treated me like a footnote in your story. You taught your daughter to see people as props. I corrected that. He bowed his head. Not in respect. In shame. We took control of Henderson Restoration Group and consolidated assets to stabilize the properties we acquired. Within 3 months, we negotiated leases that offered better terms to tenants, improved property management, and began to brand projects with care rather than arrogance. Where the Walshes had managed smoke and mirrors, we managed space for real business growth. Tyler arrived at meetings not as someone being led, but as a partner. He set terms. He learned to read financial statements like a man who has lived enough life to be careful and wise. He visited the dealerships not to gloat but to understand operations, staff morale, and how to keep people working. He treated former employees with respect and rebuilt relationships that had frayed under Gordon's pressure. The first board meeting we held in the modest conference room of Henderson Restoration was simple, honest minutes, transparent goals, and a focus on people. We will be profitable, Tyler said quietly, but not at the cost of anyone's dignity. The staff clapped, quietly, like people who had been waiting for dignity to be restored. I was asked, several times, whether I felt guilty for orchestrating their fall. The question came dressed as morality, but often intended as curiosity. Guilt is for actions without cause. What I did was legal, deliberate, and meant to protect. I had built a future for my son. a future I could have hidden away and enjoyed in silence. I chose instead to bring light to what had been left in the dark. There is a difference between flourishing quietly and lying about your stability. There is a difference between building and pillaging goodwill. 3 months after the wedding, I stood in a small conference room and watched Tyler close a deal that would stabilize several small businesses. He looked at me with a mixture of gratitude and quiet triumph. "You built this for me," he said, "not revenge." "No," I replied. "I built us a life where no one sells us a false narrative anymore." Some nights I still dream of the Walsh estate draped in roses and empty rooms, of a dining table waiting for guests who no longer come. I feel a twinge of pity, human and unavoidable. But pity is not the same as regret. When Patricia's name no longer opened doors, the community learned to be cautious. When Gordon's smile no longer earned trust, he learned humility the hard way. When Jessica found herself alone with choices she hadn't fully thought about, she started to see the world outside her curated mirror. Whether she learned compassion or merely survival, I do not pretend to know. What I do know is this: my son lives in integrity. My neighbors treat me as an equal. The businesses I helped guide employ people fairly. And every time I pass the little garden where the tulips bloom, I feel a satisfaction not of triumph over others, but of having kept a promise. The world can be cruel and petty. The difference between being crushed and standing is often whether someone has the quiet courage to plan for the future and the patience to wait for the right moment. That patience won us more than money. It won us dignity. And, in the end, dignity is the only currency worth holding. In the weeks that followed the fallout, life didn't suddenly become perfect. It simply became real. Honest. Quiet in all the right places. Loud only when it needed to be. I found myself waking up without the old weight in my chest. The weight of being tolerated, managed, placed in the shadows. There was space in my breath now. Space in my steps. And when I looked at Tyler, really looked at him, I saw a man rebuilt, not by wealth or spectacle, but by truth. One evening, we sat together on the porch, the sun melting into orange across the garden. Tyler exhaled and said, "Mom, it's strange. I thought losing them would break me, but instead, it feels like I got my life back." I looked at him, at the softness around his eyes, at the strength that had always been there but finally had room to stand. "Losing the wrong people," I said quietly, "is sometimes the only way to find yourself." He nodded slowly, letting the words settle. And that became the truth of it all. I hadn't destroyed a family. Their own behavior had done that long before I stepped in. What I did was simple. I refused to let cruelty decide our future. I refused to shrink anymore. I refused to let anyone measure me by superficial standards. This wasn't revenge. It was restoration. For every woman who has been dismissed because she is quiet, for every mother who has been insulted because she doesn't wear wealth on her sleeve, for every person who has been pushed aside, underestimated, told they do not belong. Let this story be a reminder. Silence is not weakness. Humility is not inferiority. And kindness is not permission for disrespect. Some of the strongest people in the world are the ones no one sees coming. And sometimes, life gives you only two choices. Bend until you break, or stand until they do. I chose to stand. And if you've ever been where I was, pushed to the corner of your own story, I hope you choose the same. Because your voice matters. Your dignity matters. Your story matters. Thank you truly for listening. Before you go, tell me, have you ever been underestimated or dismissed? Share your story in the comments. Someone needs to hear it. Where are you watching from? I love seeing how far these stories travel. And make sure you follow for more stories like this. Your voice deserves a place here.